The third instalment showed us advancements in translation with a proliferation of versions. This instalment considers the most widely distributed translation, the King James Version or Authorized Version. Although there had been royal approval for translating and publishing the Bible, there were still some restrictions. James I abolished the death penalty for translation, and this enabled translation to proceed unhindered. There were two competing translations at this time. The Bishop's Bible, the officially approved one, was being read in churches, and the Geneva Bible was very popular for home reading. James criticised the Geneva translation whilst hating its marginal notes. I think that of all English Bibles, that of Geneva is the worst. He described the notes as being very partial, untrue, seditious, and savouring too much of dangerous and traitorous conceits. Church leaders asked for a new translation as well, and the king hoped to appease both High Church and Low Church with a completely new translation by having both parties represented in the Committee of Translators. The king was no mean scholar himself. He had done some translation, but recognised that it needed a complete team of experts to complete a full translation, which would be generally acceptable. The translators, about 50 to start with, the numbers diminished slightly with deaths and departures. They were split into 6 companies, 2 each at Oxford, Cambridge and Westminster, and the qualifications were specified by James I. They possessed very extensive knowledge of original and relevant other languages. This enabled them to compare their understanding of the original texts with the understanding of translators of other countries. All the translators were committed believers. That is, they believed in the accuracy and the reliability of Scripture. They recognized the value of previous translations, but they also recognized the need to combine their best features. The truly good Christian reader, we never thought from the beginning that we should need to make a new translation, nor yet to make of a bad one a good one, but to make a good one better, or out of many good ones, one principal good one, not justly to be accepted against. That hath been our endeavour, that our mark. The process was defined by James I, as well as the qualifications of the translators. There were to be no marginal notes, except to explain original text. This was to counter the kind of thing that had been put into the Geneva Bible margins. Official church vocabulary was to have preference, and it was punctuated to assist public reading. When reading aloud from the King James or Authorized Version, it's as well to observe punctuation, for in most cases it is a very great help in conveying the sense to the listener. All work was read aloud for review to ensure clarity and quality of language, and that's one reason that this version is so memorable. And all work was reviewed by other companies, so there was peer review there. The inclusion of scholars of opposing religious views ensured a critical review of every aspect, Puritans and High Church and much in between, and it's influenced the English language in both vocabulary and expression. David Crystal identifies 257 expressions from the Authorized Version and preceding translations still in use in current English. This then illustrates the sources used for the production of the Authorized Version. It uses every preceding English translation and a number of Continental translations. It goes back to the original Hebrew and Greek, as well as the Aramaic, and takes into account all available foreign versions. It was supposed to be a revision of the Bishop's Bible. it ended up more like a revision of Tyndale's work, with many other versions also influencing the result, but Tyndale was not acknowledged. A 1543 Act of Parliament for the Advancement of True Religion took away permission for the use of any Bible other than the Great Bible, and specifically outlawed the writings of Tyndale, and a later act added Wycliffe and Coverdale. Tyndale's Bible was clearly and utterly abolished and forbidden to be kept or used. Here are some of its characteristics. It retains about 80% of Tyndale's Old Testament, 90% of his New Testament, and the vocabulary is biased towards Anglo-Saxon origin. Literary quality was included in the responsibilities of the translators, and it's had several minor revisions. 1769 was one of them. We'll come to those later. Before then, there was the Douay-Rheims revision of 1749 by Bishop Richard Challoner. It replaced many obscure Latinate words and made it somewhat more like the Authorized Version than it had been previously. John Wesley produced what he called his explanatory notes upon the New Testament in 1754. It was published as a translation based on the Authorized Version, with the text amended for improvement. It was influenced by ancient copies of the New Testament rather than the mainstream copies which Erasmus had used, and it's permeated by errors of Christendom where doctrine has been distorted. The two principal revisions, 1769 and 1873, one with Oxford and one with Cambridge. 1769 with Oxford, it's 1762 to 1769 with Benjamin Blayney. He went back to as many of the early editions as he could find. There was a problem that the material from the translators for the printers had disappeared completely. Nobody knows where it went, and with subsequent reprintings, errors had crept in, and names were given to some of these erroneous versions. One of the problems was that with movable type that was being used for printing, no printer had at that time sufficient type to set a complete Bible. What was happening was that a section of the Bible would be printed and many copies run off, then the type would be broken up, and the next section would then be printed, and so it would go through right to the end of the Bible. If another printing was required, they had to go back and reset every section of the Bible, except perhaps the last one, if they'd managed to retain the type that had been set for that. That's how errors crept in so easily. And then Scrivener, another revision in 1873, and this produced the Cambridge Paragraph Bible of the Authorized Version. He went back to early texts, early printings as early as he could, and he spotted some errors that Blayney had missed. There are some interesting Bibles that have been produced since the Authorized Version first came out. One of these is Bagster's Comprehensive Bible of 1827. It is the Authorized Version, a very large edition of it, with many marginal notes, which were subsequently used in the Treasury of Scripture Knowledge. There's a great deal of background material on the Holy Land, and it summarizes every chapter. There are introductions and concluding remarks to most books, and an index to Old Testament and New Testament subjects, a chronological index, and to make it truly comprehensive, an index to the notes, the introductions, and the concluding remarks. This was published by Samuel Bagster the Elder, Bagster's being a well-known publishing house specializing in Bibles and religious books. The Treasury of Scripture Knowledge was published by Samuel Bagster the Younger, in conjunction with his father, Samuel Bagster the Elder. Coming out in 1830, it was promoted by R.A. Torrey, and it had existed in some form at least 20 years earlier, and parts of that had gone into the Comprehensive Bible, and the Treasury of Scripture Knowledge itself was derived from the Comprehensive Bible and works by others. It claims to have over 500,000 cross-references, but in fact it is nearer to 800,000. And here is an illustration of it. It's laid out like a Bible, but instead of the text of the Bible, it has cross-references to other passages in the Bible dealing with the same themes, subjects, persons, or objects. Webster published in 1833 his version. It was an amendment of the Authorized Version, and his reason for this was that it's relating to the Authorized Version. In it, there were some expressions so offensive, especially to females, as to create a reluctance in young persons to attend Bible classes and schools, in which they are required to read passages which cannot be repeated without a blush. Noah Webster was the compiler of an American dictionary of the English language. Although he knew Greek and Hebrew, he made no attempt at a complete revision. This version illustrates the increasing divergence of British and American usage and vocabulary. Bagster's hexapla is not a complete Bible. It is the New Testament, published by Samuel Bagster the Elder. It consists of 6 New Testament translations in parallel across the page and the Greek text across the top. The 6 versions are Wycliffe, Tyndale, Cranmer, and Cranmer refers to the Great Bible, for which Cranmer wrote some prefaces, the Geneva, Reims, and King James. It includes a history of English translations and translators, so that's a very useful reference work for the history of the English Bible. And here is an example of it. 6 columns across with the Greek right across the top. Then we have Young's literal translation of 1863 by the same author as Young's Concordance. It's not intended to be a competitor to the Authorized Version, but rather to increase understanding by making it much more literal, and it follows the structure of the original much more closely than other literal versions, and so it's not suitable for extended public reading, being somewhat stilted in places. But it's a valuable study aid, and for any Bible student, it should be in his or her library. The emphatic diaglott is another interesting multi-version publication coming out in 1864. It has interlinear Greek and a literal English translation with a more fluent translation in a separate column down one side, based on the Vatican text rather than the received text which Erasmus had produced, and is biased towards these most ancient texts. The copyright was acquired by the Watchtower Society, but that expired in 1952, so it's now in the public domain. This 4th instalment is considered the most widely distributed translation, the King James Version or Authorized Version, and some of its successors. The final instalment takes us from the Revised Version to the present day. Until then, farewell.